The Seed and the Sower by Sir Lawrence Vanderpost. Chapter 5. The Day Far Spent. I have often been overawed in the silences of a sleepless night by the thought of the precision with which chance and circumstance work in human lives. They will contrive, for instance, that a person such as a Maori I knew should be born on the other side of the world just in time to meet a German bullet in his forehead 30 years later in a Libyan desert, while I, who was leading him, was delivered with as nice a calculation. But of the many imposing expositions I have witnessed of the working of these precision instruments of life, none struck me as so subtle as those which took me to Palestine. I went against my will, and yet no assignment could have fitted more neatly into the jigsaw pattern of my desperation than this posting to Palestine. I found myself stationed at a monastery called Imwash. The monks had moved out only a few days before to their parent monastery a mile or so back at a place called Latrun. There was still a smell as of frankincense and myrrh from their centuries of occupation, hanging about the cool corridors and the grey stone halls when I moved in with my band of cutthroats. For some weeks I and other men younger than I, but with even older faces, taught these desperate characters the kind of killing and clandestine warfare in which we had become specialists. They were a strange lot, all with their own idea and aptitude for killing. For instance, the best shot among them was a boy with a squint and a contortionist body who had a Jewish father and an Arab mother, and who aimed his gun with his right eye from his left shoulder. In him, as in them all, the normal proportions seemed inverted with the macabre logic to serve all the better their mission of death. In the mornings I marched them out and taught them how to handle explosives, lay booby traps, set time fuses and delayed action bombs, together with unarmed combat and other tricks of silent killing. In the afternoons I lectured them out of my experience and tried to make their imaginations at home in the background against which they would have to do their work. At night I would take them out into the hills behind the monastery and play at stalking human game in the deep gullies, wadis, orchards of olives and fig trees on their terrace slopes. Usually between lectures and night maneuvers, I would march them out before sunset to watch the time fuses and delayed charges that we had set in the morning explode. The dust of the explosions would hang golden between us and the sinking sun in the still air. I had always thought our African high-veiled light was the purest in the world. I was wrong. There is nothing so lovely as the autumnal evening light in Palestine. I remember on the first evening standing there apart from my soldiers, looking beyond the dust to the olive trees, figs, vineyards, and slender cypresses, feeling the explosion still reeling in my senses, and thinking that this was a strange way to treat a holy land. Once the feeling was sharpened almost unendurably by the sight of a lone gazelle, one of the loveliest of the lean buck of the Palestinian hills, startled by the sounds and leaping high on a crest of Purple Hill, just as Stompy had once done in the great plain behind the prehistoric hills at home. Oh, it was ever present, this prick of memory which had been tempered like a surgeon's needle in the general nightmare of betrayal in my being. I would be grateful then for the odd charge which had not exploded, and the duty which compelled me to go and examine it, because, as commanding officer, it was I who had to execute this most dangerous of all tasks in our training mission. One evening, so still and clear that the light standing brimful between the hills around us was like crystal water, and the slight air of evening sent a faint but rhythmical tremble through it like the tail of a fish in a clear mountain pool, I was counting the explosions thus, and felt almost relieved to find that one had failed. I was closing in on it fast when it went off and a rock the size of a rugger ball just missed my head. As the dust and shock cleared from my eyes, I saw sitting on a boulder some 200 yards away a civilian who had no business to be there at all. I went over to him quickly. He was a monk, but despite his priest's clothes, I spoke to him sternly. So relieved was I to find an outlet for the mixed emotions of shock and chagrin within me. He was a tall, middle-aged man with a slight stoop, yellow hair that was closely cropped, and a pair of fine blue eyes and a wide forehead. He was heavily bearded as well, and as a result, the only light in his face came from his eyes and brow. He listened to me patiently, and at the end said in English with a German accent, "I am sorry if I have done anything wrong, sir, and give you concern. But for many years now, long before our superiors in Jerusalem handed over our monastery to the military for 30 pieces of silver, I have come here every evening to look both at it and the view. You need not be afraid I'll do anything stupid. I know all about explosives. I too have been a serviceman once. But I'll not come here again if you forbid it. With that, he turned as if to go to where the greater monastery sat snugly a mile away, below a hill securely tucked in behind screens of flickering cypress, glistening olive trees, and wide autumnal vineyards of gold. However, his manner had made such an impression on me that I asked in a more conciliatory tone, "You say you've been a serviceman too? How, when, and where?" He turned round and said slowly, "I was a German submarine officer in the 1418 war." "And in this?" I asked, beginning again to feel aggressive. But he was impervious to the change of tone and said, "I became a monk in 1919 and have been here in the Holy Land ever since." He paused, and we stood there looking at each other. He broke out of the silence first and asked, "Do you think you could possibly tell me how the war is going?" I started, willingly enough, to give him the latest war news without realizing that I was on the wrong track. He interrupted me again, saying, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean that war. I meant your war." "In your countries, too," I answered sharply, thinking that, like many Germans, he was disclaiming responsibility for it. "Forgive me," he answered quietly, "if I have presumed too much on a priest's privilege and introduced into your private affairs. But I thought I recognized a look on your face that I seemed to remember on my own in 1917. He paused. "It was then that I first realized that the war I was fighting was in me long before I was in the world without. I realized that I was fighting in was heisst? A secondary dimension of reality." "Oh, that's all right," I said uncomfortably, not at all prepared to continue such a disturbing line of conversation with a stranger, even though the stranger were a priest. So I went on instead to say, "Look, if you've been coming here every evening, don't let us break the habit. I can easily arrange for my men to practice these explosions at a safer distance." At that, a new expression came into his somber eyes. He thanked me, saying he would appreciate greatly such permission and begged me to allow him to explain why he so valued coming there in the evening. For 20 years, he told me, he had been coming here because this dip in the land where we practiced our combats was, for him, the most hallowed ground in Palestine. It was there, he said, that Christ first revealed himself to his disciples after the resurrection. He waved his hands, now almost transparently white from the many years of concealment in his monk sleeves, at the land below us. The sun was just going down, and the shadows were already running deep like flowing water in the Wadis. He said that there, exactly where the monastery stood, the disciples, some as stunned by their private hesitations and evasions during those critical hours between Christ's apprehension and his crucifixion as by the crucifixion itself, and all like sheep at nightfall in a world of wolves without a shepherd, were gathered fearfully together. Then suddenly, he came out of a sunset sky and appeared before his anguished followers. They did not recognize him, but out of their own deep hurt, and in their fear welcoming any addition to their numbers, they made him welcome, saying, "Abide with us, for the day is far spent." Here there was a pause, and then my companion went on to say that, as for himself, he came there every night to relive that hour. He came to remind himself of his own evasions and failure to recognize the resurrected one during the day, and to wait until he was ready to fall on his own knees for pardon of his daily acts of unbelief. "But how do you know that this was the place?" I asked abruptly. The great bell had suddenly begun tolling the dark hour in the monastery, and I rather shot the question at him because I felt that the emotion roused in me by his tale, and the manner of his telling it, would disturb me unless I clung to what were still to me the main facts of life. "The first pilgrims discovered it and marked the place," he replied. "The Crusaders followed to build this, their first church and monastery, on the designated spot, exactly where you now do your work." His words again made me uncomfortable. His capacity for disconcerting me seemed unfailing. yet I wanted him to say more. However, he excused himself gently, asking if I had not heard the bell. That was his call to duty, as I had mine over there. He pointed to where my men huddled restless on the slope. If I liked, he concluded, we could meet again any evening I chose, in the same place, for now that I had been so good as to give him permission, he would keep up the custom. And with that he walked, still with a marked seaman's roll under his monk's habit, into the growing dark, the bell tolling all the time and shaking the brown air with wave upon wave of urgent sound. But I did not see him again. I woke the next morning with one of my periodical recurrences of malaria, the worst I had experienced since I left the Bushveld. We had no doctor attached to my staff, for we were only a small, oddly select unit, an aristocracy, if you like, of killers, nor would I allow my adjutant to telephone to Jerusalem for one. I had had malaria so often in the past that I felt I knew better than any doctor what to do. I promptly dosed myself with quinine, got my Batman to pile my bed high with rugs and greatcoats, and settled down to wait confidently for my ague to stop and the sweat to burst out and break the fever. But as the day wore on, it soon became evident that this was no ordinary attack. The ague got worse, my temperature rose, and no sweat relieved the fever. In the afternoon, an age of ice seemed to have entered my blood and to be rattling my bones. When I am really ill, my instinct is for life, and not man to nurse me. When I come to die, I hope it may be in the open, face to face with sky and stars, so I may be able to commit my spirit without reserve to its keeper, the wind. So now, with the help of my Batman, I struggled out into the open to lie under the sky facing the lee of the slope where the monk and I had met the evening before. There at last I felt my fever had room to spread its wings, for that is what fever needs. Fever is time-grown strange wings, the mind feathered to range great distances between an anguished, brittle moment in the present and one's first drop into being. Hardly was I laid in the open, then such consciousness as I had took flight. I forgot my aching and my shivering vanished, and I just went with a single, overwhelming thought swiftly backwards, until I came to the moment where once a great darkness had gathered over the land on which I lay. I could feel the earth heave itself in agony beneath my ear, hear the temple rent with this lightning sound, to be followed by a terrible silence wherein the only murmur was the blood hissing in my ear, like an angry sea among the rocks. The silence became so frightening, so full of the nothingness of which I have spoken, that I could endure it no longer and flung myself up in the bed to look for something to fill it. I saw the sun setting and realized my fever had brought me out at the moment where a little huddle of stricken followers were preparing for the night on the place where the monastery, my future workshop of war, was to be built. Then, in the focus of my fever, I saw first the huddle of men, and then he himself, coming down a footstep, winding through figs and sparkling olives just as the monk had described it to me. The sunset was like a halo around his head. And yet, now that he had come, the occasion was so ordinary that I was not surprised that he was not recognized. How hard to learn that our own brief wonder is not worked in heaven, but in the grains of sand at our feet, that miracle is not in the stars, but in the fearful flesh and blood piled on the moonbone beneath our shrinking skin. The men now huddled about him could not see the miracle, for in their fear they were looking too far, too high. Then I heard one of them, dark with bereavement like a crow at nightfall, say to him, "Abide with us, for the day is far spent, brother." But his tone implied no recognition. As I watched it all, his presence crackling like a fire within my senses, I began to understand more fully their failure in recognition. He was the same, but he was translated. The perishable script of himself was left in the archives somewhere around Gethsemane, and only the translation was now present. He had been rendered into a new idiom which could not be read. It was therefore no surprise to me that instead of answering the invitation directly, he asked instead with some suddenness, "But why are you not all here?" "Indeed, we are all here," one of them replied. He shook his head decisively, answering, "Judas is not here." The amazement on their faces was great, partly, perhaps, because of the implication in tone that he wished Judas to be there, and also perhaps because he evidently did not seem to know of Judas's fate, which was by now common knowledge throughout the land. Then, in my fever, I saw one of them stand slowly to his feet and answer, "But surely, master, you know Judas is dead. He hanged himself." Both by his action, words, and tone, I knew that at last revelation had come to that questioner. At this, the resurrected one turned his back on the speaker and spoke out clearly yet with anguish. "This cannot be true. If I fail in this, I fail in all else besides." He looked up. "Father, this life which you have set beyond men needs Judas just as it needs me. His deed, too, is redeemed in the love which exacted it of him." Saying this, he half turned again, and I was able to see that his eyes were entirely without light. While the others huddled together, still dazed by revelation, I got up unhesitatingly, and shivering, I went and knelt at his feet, saying, "There are many rumors in Jerusalem and Rome that are not true. See, I am Judas. I am alive, and I am here." As I spoke, the light came back into his face, and leaning forward, he took both my hands in his and helped my fever-shaken body to its feet. Then, looking upwards, he exclaimed, "Thank you, Father. Now at last we can both be free." "But I'm not free," I hastened to add. "I had a brother once, and I betrayed him." "Go to your brother," he said at once, "and make your peace with him, even as I have had to do with my need of you." At that, I felt the sweat break out on my skin and run down my body like tropical rain. I began slowly to grow warm again, and I could hear the cool wind of an autumn nightfall stirring down the slope and through the leaves. For long I had feared the voice of the wind, but now I was grateful for the sound. It was almost dark, and the stars were dropping their light like tears of compassion upon the night. Amazed, I looked around me. There were no people to be seen. I was quite alone, yet for the first time in many years, I did not feel lonely. I stretched back into my blankets and lay down, watching the stars go down behind the hill between Imwash and Bethlehem. I don't think I slept at all, and yet it was the shortest night I have ever known. The day came so swiftly that night. The day came so swiftly that night could have been the mere shadow of a cloud passing across the sun. My own darkness had been overtaken at last. When morning came, I knew clearly what I was going to do. I felt like a ship long becalmed, reeling in the wind that had last found its sails. I was going at once to my brother. War and the clash of the world's armies seemed insignificant in comparison with that slight deed. For the first time I feared lest I be killed before I could accomplish it. Death, I now understood, was a moment of supreme truth that one could only meet with equal truth. I prayed that I should not carry this secret, this lie of my betrayal with me into death. My resourcefulness, which I had thrown so wholeheartedly into destruction, was now diverted towards quite another course of action. Before breakfast I had ordered a doctor from Jerusalem. That same day I had his order for a month's convalescent leave in my pocket. Though everyone declared it impossible, I managed to get from Palestine to Egypt, and from Egypt, with the help of old friends in the South African Air Force, by stages to my home. Barely a fortnight later, I got out of a train one morning at the little railway sliding near my brother's home. Everyone stared hard at my uniform, which they found as difficult to recognize as they did me. I managed to hire an old car for the day because that was all the time I could allow myself if I were to be back before my leave expired, and I drove to my brother's farm. During all this period, I scarcely had eyes for the outside world at all, but even now I could not help noticing how dry was the world. There was no grass left on the veld, and the scrub was twisted and burnt black in the sun's fire. Sheep and cattle were so thin that their ribs and bones seemed to pierce their taut skins. Vultures, crows, and buzzards circled the sky wherever some drought-stricken creature lay, and wherever I got out of the car and opened a gate, the smell of death assailed my nose. Yet despite the tragedy of the thirsty land and the half-starved animals, as the morning wore on and I passed through great gray plains between shimmering blue hills and came nearer to my brother's home, a strange excitement began to rise in me. In the northwest, where our rains come from, I saw the snow peaks of a range of thunderclouds mounting in the sky, but by the time I got to my brother's home, they were turning black. Almost in their shadow, I drove up an avenue of trembling poplars grown tall and broad since my last visit, drew up sharply before the wide stoop, jumped out, and ran up the steps. Before I could knock, the front door opened, and my brother's wife came out. I had never known her well, but I remarked what an austere spirit their joint struggle with the difficult earth had made of her. She recognized me immediately, yet in the very act of recognition her expression hardened in a way that was not promising. She did not even offer me her cheek to kiss, but held out a cool hand and then managed to collect herself to explain. "This is a surprise. Come in and I'll go and call your brother. He'll be amazed to see you. Why didn't you send us word you were coming?" "That's a long story," I said quickly, "and I can explain later." "Where is he? I'll go and find him."
"Then I'll go on seeing to the dinner," she answered, not without relief. "He's in the garden at the back, leading the last of our water to the trees and vegetables. We've had a terrible time, as you've noticed, I expect. No rain for a year, sheep and cattle dying, and all this lovely garden practically dead."
She looked at me as if I'd been away enjoying myself somewhere instead of fighting a war. "Oh, it must have been terrible," I agreed at once. "But it looks as if the rain is on its way at last."
"It's come up like this a dozen times recently, only to be blown away by evening," she answered grimly.
I left her on that note and went to look for my brother. I found him in the center of the garden, leading a trickle of water with infinite patience and care from one parched, withering tree to the other. I saw him before he saw me. Of course, he looked older, more bent, in fact, almost twisted like one of the indigenous thorn trees of our thirsty land. Indeed, he appeared to be so much a part of the earth that he might have grown out of it. I noticed the hump on his back was more pronounced than before, but at that moment he heard me and turned round with the disconcerting adroitness so unexpected in one with so awkward a frame. He saw me and went still with shock. His dark eyes looked into my blue ones, and I saw their light was still imprisoned in a moment far back in time. How well I knew it, and how clearly I understood it now that I was free. Had I not learnt lately that death is not something that happens at the end of our life? It is imprisonment in one moment of time, confinement in one sharp, uncompromising deed or aspect of ourselves. It is imprisonment in one moment of time, confinement in one sharp, uncompromising deed or aspect of ourselves. Death is exclusion from renewal of our present-day selves. Neither heaven nor hell are hereafter. Hell is time arrested within and refusing to join in the movement of wind and stars. Heaven is the boulder rock unrolled to let new life out. It is man restored to all four of his seasons, rounding for eternity. So I went up to my brother, and putting both hands on his shoulders, said, "It's good to see you again, Ubud. Still growing things."
He stammered, "Ubud, I wish I'd known you were coming. I'd have liked to be there to meet you. But come on up to the house. You must be tired. Can you stay long?"
"No, Ubudi," I said and explained quickly. "I have no right in a sense to be here at all. It's taken me a fortnight to get here, and I'll be lucky to be back to the front in time if I'm not to get into serious trouble. So I'm going back in a few hours to catch the night train north. I've been hitchhiking my way by air down there. I've come here just to see you and spend these few hours with you."
"Really, Ubud?" he said as if he could not believe his ears. "Is that really so?"
"Of course," I told him, tightening my grip on his shoulders, and feeling I had no time even to go through the conventional motions of such a meeting. So I went straight to the heart of the matter and told him I had come to tell him of a great wrong I had once done him, and to ask his forgiveness.
"Oh, but surely, Uboot," he began to protest, but more out of habit than real feeling, I was sure. So I interrupted him, begging him to listen, and went on, without pause or evasion, to tell him the story of my betrayal as I saw it. He listened without interruption, and with growing intensity. A hush seemed to have fallen over the fast-approaching storm, and not even a mutter of distant thunder broke through the stillness in the parched garden. When I had finished, he turned and stared at me, and I saw that there were tears in his eyes. "Uboot," he said in a voice I had not heard since one of our moments of reconciliation when we slept as children under the stars. "You mean, you've come all this way? Spent the only leave you've ever taken since the war began? Just to come and tell me this?" I nodded, too upset to speak. Also, suddenly I was now afraid that what I'd said seemed too little for so much. I looked away to where beyond the withered orchards the dark clouds were uncurling ponderously in the diminishing blue, wondering what I would do if he, too, should find my words wanting. Then I felt my hands taken in rough ploughman's fingers. "Uboot, you've done many fine things," he said gently, "but never a braver than you've done today." He paused. "I've been afraid of this all along, but I only knew it for certain that day when you shot Stompy." He broke off, and I stared at him. "You knew?" He nodded. "But now we're free of it all, thanks to you." I realized with amazement that further words were unnecessary between us. Then I heard my brother, with characteristic solicitude, saying quickly, "You look dead beat. Let's get back to the house. You go on ahead. I just want to turn off the water. Can't afford to waste a drop." At his words, physical fatigue flooded me, and yet somehow became part of a new warmth produced by the release of the old tenderness between us. My brother's wife was waiting for me below the stoop. Curiosity and anxiety joined in her tense expression. But before either she or I could speak, I heard my brother begin to sing in the garden, as I had not heard him sing since childhood. He sang the verse I knew, which was of his own composition. Right through the day, right through the moonlight, right through the night, for far in the distance burns your fire, for someone who has waited long. Then he started a second stanza, which was new to me. I rode all through the day, rode through the moonlight, rode all through the night, to the fire in the distance, and beside the fire found he who had waited for so long. I was deeply moved by the song, and the woman standing by my side reacted almost violently. "Dear heaven!" she exclaimed. "Do you know ever since we've been married he's never sung a note? I'd never believed he could ever sing like that again." At that moment the thunder rumbled deep and long from end to end of the hills and the great plain. It was as if heaven itself had spoken. When the sound died away in the silence that followed, we could hear only the wind moaning in the distance.
My brother's wife looked at me, her face suddenly grown soft as a young girl's.
"I'm glad you came," she said quickly, "but come in and rest. I am so glad I happen to have got a rather nice meal today, and I believe you've brought us luck. I believe it's going to rain at last."
We turned and looked at the sky above the garden. There could be no more doubt. The cavalry of the great army of cloud was rounding up the last stray bits of blue. Thunder rang out again and again, loud and long, and the lonely hills on the end of the plain went white with the advance mist of the storm. Then we saw the rain itself come up fast, rushing with a sound like that of the great wind of the first spirit of life, once more taking up its quest on the parched and long-rejected earth upon which we stood.